All right, well, we're going to get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Don Saucier. I'm the Faculty Associate Director of the Teaching and Learning Center. Thank you so much for finding your way to our professional development series. We're going to begin today with a land acknowledgement.
All right, let me share my screen and sound. Okay, can you see what you're supposed to be seeing? Okay, thanks, Don. Okay, here we go.
As the first land-grant institution established under the 1862 Morrill Act, we acknowledge that the state of Kansas is, historically, home to many native nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Pawnee, among others. Furthermore, Kansas is the current home to 4 federally recognized native nations: the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and the Sac and Fox Nation Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska.
Many native nations utilize the western plains of Kansas as their hunting grounds, and others, such as the Delaware, were moved through this region during Indian removal efforts to make way for white settlers. It's important to acknowledge this, since the land that serves as the foundation of this institution was, and still is, stolen land.
We remember these truths because K-State's status as a land-grant institution is a story that exists within ongoing settler colonialism and rests on the dispossession of indigenous peoples and nations from their lands. These truths are often invisible to many. The recognition that K-State's history begins and continues through indigenous contexts is essential.
Please remember
These truths,
because we still remember.
Thank you. For those of you who haven't been to a teaching chat before at the TLC, basically what happens is we have opportunity to talk about whatever we want. We also have a primary topic that we'll kind of talk about as we go through. Before we get to that chat, I kind of want you thinking about, what do I want to spend this day talking about? We'll do a little bit of announcements. So first of all, our chat is today. Next week, we have a wonderful event coming up with Camilla Roberts, who directs our honor and integrity system. And Camilla will be talking about academic integrity. We'll also later in the semester, because I realize things like ChatGPT are predominating a lot of our thoughts about academic integrity, we'll have more of a focus on artificial intelligence in higher ed, not only in just our series, but kind of some other events across campus. So be ready for that next week and moving forward. We also have the opportunity for those of you who would like to earn a professional development certificate for you to do so. We have professional development certificates for graduate students as well as for faculty or staff members. That information has been dropped in the chat. If you'd like to be a fellow of the Teaching and Learning Center, we also have information about how you can do that. And if you have any questions about any of those things, please reach out to us. I'll also remind you, if anything happens today that you say, oh my God, a colleague who couldn't be here needs to see this, we archive all of these. This is recording right now, and we will upload it to our webpage after this event for asynchronous viewing later. So if someone can't make our series, which is noon every Wednesday over Zoom, if you can't make it, you can still be part of a lot of cool things, including earning those professional development certificates, because we have that opportunity for asynchronous participation. Having said that, I want to thank all of you who made time to be here in real time, because now you're my favorite. This is fun. So we are in the 6th week of the fall semester, which is kind of blowing my mind just a little bit. And as we're kind of getting to the point where, yesterday in class, my students were tired with like a capital T. And normally I have a great exchange with my students, and they were kind of sort of doing it a little bit, but nowhere near to that normal level. So I think yesterday, me just getting through those classes with the energy that I was able to put out was a win for me. I'd love to hear a couple more of the wins that people have. So if you want to volunteer a win that you've had recently in your teaching, you want to unmute and put it up there, or you want to drop it in the chat, that's awesome. Someone said they were setting up teams for a simulation yesterday, and one of the groups called themselves Team Tired. Yeah, that's the thing right now. Absolutely a thing. So any teaching wins that someone would like to share?
I have one that also connects to today's teaching chat, which is that, and I also have a plug for the book club. We've been reading New College Classroom. It's a fantastic book, and I got really excited because in the last chapter that we read, it had an activity that was called Everybody Raise Your Hand. And so you ask everybody to raise their hand, and then you call on the students and you let them know. So I wrote on the board, I said, you can say, I don't know, but I think that somebody else in the class does. You can say, I'm not sure, but the answer might be. And then you can also say, like, I feel fairly confident that the answer is whatever. And so I did that activity today in class. We were talking about some historical background of a medieval Spanish legend that influenced Coronado's expedition in 1540 to the territory that is today Kansas. And so it was a lot of historical facts that we had to kind of cover. And I usually try to avoid answers that have specific questions, or specific questions that have specific answers. But there was no doing that today. And so I had the students do that, and they did awesome. It was really great. They all raised their hands. I asked them questions. They were really good about answering or being like, I don't know, but I think they do. And you would see like, they kind of get this like look on their face, like, oh, and then they go, I think it's actually, and they would say their answer. They'd say like, I'm not sure how to say this in Spanish, but, and then we would work out how to say it in Spanish. And it was just, they came in really tired, but they showed up for that activity, and I'm definitely doing it again.
That is fantastic. Now, one of the things I do kind of want to put out there is sometimes when we try active learning technique, which is, sort of the goal of some of our chat today, sometimes they don't go as well as Dr. Faber's kind of talking about. So I love that it did. And I think that's a really cool thing. And I love that your students get to create some connections while they were learning their Spanish. And I think with active learning, finding a ways to have students kind of have connection with the academic content and each other is a great thing. Melissa mentioned in teaching her CAT community, students are building strong relationships, including with the learning assistant, who is also doing an amazing job. I will say that I have a CAT community with an amazing learning assistant as well. I have a wonderful teaching assistant. You know him and love him. His name is Noah Renkin, and he helps in my classes too. And having wonderful support people with you just makes this whole endeavor a lot easier. So props to all those people who support us in all those ways. Any other wins someone would like to share? See, this is the point when I'm teaching where I remind my students my questions are not rhetorical. And I would invite at least one more response before we moved on. And yes, Melissa said everyone should have a Noah in their lives. That is absolutely true. I know someone's got to win. I know someone's got to win.
I'll share a win through a loss. How's that?
You know what? I'll allow that. Thank you, Brandon.
So I'm teaching a class for the first time this semester, and I'm using a new publisher resource, new book, new simulations that they just released during the summer. And so we had a simulation that was due last Friday, and we went through on Monday, and I just walked them through the entire thing, and they went onto the tool online, and like I let them kind of re-enter the right answers, and it was still showing as wrong. And they weren't getting any feedback as to why it was wrong. And I was stuck. I'm like, I don't know. I'm like, let me reach out to the publisher. I'll get back to you. And so thankfully the publisher was really responsive. I had a call with him yesterday. And so today in class, I was like, yep, it was broken. Sorry, you guys. Here's what we're going to do to fix it. But I reminded them that we're trying things for the first time. We're kind of on the edge of this particular learning tool. And thankfully, the publisher is working hand in hand with us to make sure it's a good experience. And I think the students took it pretty well.
Very nice. And I think you're demonstrating growth mindset, authenticity, all the things. I love that, Brandon. And now Brandon has let the rest of y'all off the hook unless anyone has an additional win that they want to chime in. But I'm assuming because of the awkward silence, you did not. So we'll kind of continue. Ted mentioned, by the way, that he's learning R for data analysis. And while not a teaching win necessarily, also that's pretty huge. So good job, Ted. Oh, someone said their students are doing a case study discussion assignment where they're responsible to lead the class for 10 to 15 minutes. Yesterday, the class was so engaged, it lasted over 20 minutes. It is awesome when you get so involved in those activities and those active learning moments that it actually exceeds the time you have budgeted for them. That's fantastic. And we'll figure out how to catch up later. So that's great. Thank you for sharing that. So the primary chat topic today is going to be active learning. But before we get to that, if anyone has a crisis, a question, a concern, event that they'd like to share, I want to give space for that.
I do, not really so much an unresolved one, but just kind of a reminder that I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but also sort of a win through a loss, I guess. So all that just to say, I make it a point to talk to my students, especially my first year students, about resources on campus, including some that they might not be as apt to ask about, like counseling services, the Care Center, the LGBT Center, now Spectrum. And I also talk about some of my personal experiences a little bit with the class in some of those regards so that they feel comfortable talking to me. And I have a student who shared with me a sexual assault that she had been through in high school and was still dealing with some of the court things. And the court things then opened up again this past week, and it's been a really big trigger for her. But she feels comfortable talking to me and to my learning assistant, and she knows the resources and feels that support, even though it's really tricky with her family. She graduated early from high school to get away from it, in fact, so it's still pretty fresh in her experience. So just kind of a reminder that anytime you feel comfortable and are able to share with your students those resources and show yourself to be a safe person, it's really super important to do. And to encourage them to talk to anybody about those things, because it just happens way more often than is reported. I mean, I know you all know that, but it's just something that happens every semester that I end up talking to a student about something trauma related. And so everything you do to be empathetic is really, really super important. And also just knowing that students don't always share those things. So if they have stuff going on and they tell you I'm fine, or they don't give reasons for absences or late work or whatnot, it may be due to trauma they haven't processed yet. So just kind of a reminder about those things. I have a student whose mother died 2 months ago that just kind of barely mentioned it to me and hadn't mentioned it to her learning assistant. So she seems to be doing okay, but we kind of know to keep that in mind with her. So just kind of a reminder, and I'd love to hear if anybody else has any specific things they do to help students feel comfortable knowing that a lot of them do have those past or even current traumas.
So Melissa, I want to get people to respond to your kind of query about what other people can do. But before we do that, I want to thank you for doing that for your students. For those of you who have kind of empathy built into your teaching philosophies and practices, which I absolutely recommend that you do, there's a lot of emotional burden that goes along with that. And I think that's part of the reason some people don't, kind of involve that place for their classes. So thank you for reminding us to make those resources available and for doing what you're doing for your students. So what are other things that people do to support their students in this way? Deborah, I see your hand.
Mine is not on this particular topic.
Okay, I'll keep your hand raised and I'll come back to you when we've gotten through this. So what are other things that people do? I do think making those resources available on your syllabus, on your Canvas site, referring your students to them at times when you think it might be, time to think about that. Think about the midterm of the semester, the end of the semester, around your big assessment dates. If you have, big exams or things like that, might not be a bad thing to kind of do to let students know this is happening, and to let students know that if they're just struggling with something, you might be able to let them know which of the resources based on what it is they're struggling with, they might want to start at first. We had a wonderful event a little bit ago by Andy Thompson. So if you're not aware of some of those resources, check that out on our archived events, and you'll hear Andy talk about a lot of the things that our university is able to provide to students. Beth, are you responding to this issue? Okay.
I was just gonna say that I do a lot of the same things that you just actually shared, right? Like having it in the syllabus. I have a notebook that I keep all my notes in from things like this. These are meetings and stuff. And that page with all of the resources that Andy shared, I don't know, a couple of years ago, it's bookmarked. Like I go back to it often. I have that with me so that if there's a student that happens to mention something to me, I can just immediately go to it or say, hey, walk with me to my office. Let me, get you the name of this. Sometimes I even pull it up online so they can see what it looks like. I send it to them in an email, whatever. But one of the other things that I try to do is just to check in with my students that miss class or that I know might be struggling through email. And it's just like a really informal, like, hey, I'm just checking in, like we missed you, or you seemed kind of quiet in class yesterday, and I know that's not like you. Are you feeling okay? Like, hope everything's okay. And kind of leave it like open. They don't have to respond, they don't have to whatever. But more often than not, that opens the door for them to share whatever may be happening, whether it's they aren't feeling good or their partner, had COVID and they started feeling kind of crummy in the middle of class, like whatever it is. I've heard it. It's just a very informal way, but to let them know that you're thinking about them and that you see them. In fact, several of them have said, thank you for making me feel like, someone cares for me, right? Or that someone sees me or acknowledges me. So that's just something that I do.
Thank you, Beth. I really appreciate that. Brandon.
I've probably shared this previous years, so I'll try to keep it brief, but I usually have a segment. It's about, I think it's next week that I'll share it. It's kind of once we're starting to get to the middle of the year, where I'll talk about suicide prevention. I'll share a story of how I lost my brother-in-law to suicide over a decade ago, and just try to make it really intimate, and then tie that into mental health, to mental illness, to depression, and just say, look, these are real things, and it's okay if you're experiencing them. We wish that my brother-in-law had said something. All we need to do is say something to one of us, and we would have been there to help him, and then talk through some of the resources they have available here. And it's usually every semester I'll get at least one student who will say, hey, that was to me, thank you for sharing, either because they're dealing with someone who's dealing with that, or they're dealing with it themselves.
And I really appreciate it. And several of the people who have contributed to this conversation have done this, but you're modeling and normalizing these kinds of things and letting people know it's not just you, it might be the people around you, as Melissa is saying in the chat. So I really do appreciate that. And I appreciate you trusting your students with that information. Andy.
So one of the things that I have been doing recently, and I'm going to preface this by saying that I recognize that this might not be a possibility in all teaching contexts, but where you can, offering students an opportunity to redo assessments based on feedback can be a really helpful thing that allows for students, like Melissa was saying, is that sometimes students don't even come forward, or they haven't started to process their trauma. They may not even be really aware that they're at a point where they're struggling yet. And so sometimes it can be hard, you say, like, if you're struggling, come talk to me. And the student hasn't really been able to acknowledge to themselves that they're struggling. And so if they haven't acknowledged that to themselves, how are they going to come to me? And so having in some of my classes, I have it set up so that when they complete an assessment, if they don't do well on it, my assessment points are it meets standards, it's approaching standards, or it's below standards. And if it's approaching or below, they have an opportunity to revise and resubmit. And so that the assessment itself becomes part of the learning process. And that can be a way that for students who are really struggling, I can see it in their work and I can connect with them. And it gives them a little bit of flexibility that if they're struggling and haven't figured it out yet, it's not going to knock their grade in the same way it would if I just said, well, you got a D on this assignment, moving on to the next one. So again, I recognize that that's not always a possibility in all of our teaching contexts, but just something to consider in your teaching if that's something that you'd be able to do on some of your assignments.
So Andy, what I really like that you did there is you didn't just talk about having an empathetic perspective, in terms of personal interactions. You talked about actually having a course structure that infuses empathy into that too. And that's something that I think we should be thinking about ways to incorporate. I appreciate that. Thank you. Deborah, what would you like to talk about?
Hi, I'm the instructional designer for the College of Arts and Sciences, and I just wanted to put a word out to everyone in this group that the Spanish Studies program and the Department of Modern Languages has been piloting VoiceThread, and they were able to get a discounted price for a year to pilot it. And it's an unlimited active user license, which actually embeds inside of Canvas. So you can see how the integration with VoiceThread and Canvas would work, which is much more superior for grading and things like that than the $100 a year account that a instructor might want to pay out of pocket for. So they were able to obtain this pilot license for 1 year. And because it is an unlimited active user license, I wanted to make sure that everyone knows that if they want to try out VoiceThread for the spring and see how it works, it would be a good time to do it, because I'm trying to work through IT to promote this as a possible technology that we would adopt at K-State. But in order for us to do that, we need to have more voices of people saying, you know, we really need this. It would improve learning and success at K-State. And the only way we can do that is if more of us are actually using it. So I'm not just saying you have to be in the College of Arts and Sciences, because it is unlimited. It's something that we can offer to anyone. So please reach out to me if you're interested, and I'll get a hold of IT and have them activate it into your account, because it does have to be activated at the, I think, in the user level, but it's unlimited. So if you have any questions on that, Andy, I think, is really involved in VoiceThread and can give us more information. And then on November the 4th, there's going to be a coffee collaboration at Hell Library, where we'll be actually showing it and talking about it.
Yeah, and my colleague, Dr. Raylan Hale, is the super guru on VoiceThread. I've used it in a number of classes and in a number of different ways before. It can be great for group projects, and it's very collaborative and asynchronous, and so it can be great for asynchronous online courses. Students get to collaborate even though they're not doing it at the same time. So if you want to have your online courses be more interactive and not require students to be there all at the same time, I highly recommend giving it a try.
So there is a question in the chat about a little bit more about what you can do with it. So for those of us who aren't familiar with it, and I wondered if either you or Deborah could give us a little bit of an insight into that.
Yeah, what I really like about it is that it makes it more of a collaborative way for you to work with your students and for your students to communicate with each other. Even though you don't have to be together at the same time, you can be posting, for instance, a video that you're watching, a reaction to a spot in the video. And so depending on where you post your reaction to that particular spot, it'll pin it. So you could see, 15 people reacting to that very same thing as they post individually. And then when they watch it, you can see everyone's responses. So it's really cool.
Yeah, so just a quick, what is it? Basically, you can upload slides. You have a slide deck. And anything can be a slide. So you can just upload directly a PowerPoint presentation and it'll have all the different slides. You can upload videos as a slide in your presentation. You can upload images. And then students you can record yourself talking about what there is on the slides. You can ask them prompts. You can put questions up written on the slides. And the students can comment using just a voice comment, a video comment, a written comment. They can also use drawing tools. And so you can have them draw on the slides. So if you're showing, for example, a video and you want them to point out things that they notice, they can pause the video in their comment and then circle here in this part of the video is where I notice X. Students, you can also set the settings so that students can add their own slides. And so some of the types of activities that we'll do is that in a class slide production, we'll say on the next slide, we want you to create a meme about X topic. And then the students will create their own slide, they'll have a meme, and then they have to talk a little bit about what their inspiration was or whatnot. And they can comment, they can make their own original comments. They can respond to other students' comments. You can explain to them whether they should make their own individual comment or respond to others, or make one comment of your own and respond to two other people. So it's like a discussion board on steroids
Which
that
is
really
dynamic.
works. Like it's really awesome.
Yeah, you could think of discussions in Canvas as being static, and VoiceThread is dynamic, very interactive.
Well, thank you for putting that us on our radars. I really appreciate that. I'll also put out a feature that people are talking about, the chat. I only found out about this recently too. But a way you can check in on your students in Canvas is you can actually have emails sent only to students who, for instance, haven't submitted assignment 7 or something like that. So it's a really a little bit more focused way than emailing the whole class to check on students who might be experiencing something that's interfering with their academic performance. So that is a really cool thing in the Canvas feature I didn't know about till a couple weeks ago. So I'm glad people put that in the chat. All right. So any other concerns, crises, events that people have to get out for now? All right, so we're going to talk about active learning now. So active learning basically is students doing stuff, right? So rather than just sitting back and listening to us lecture and listen to us read our slides, is then students actually doing stuff. So it's going to deepen their learning. It's engaging. It's awesome in so many ways. And what I want us to do is I want us to crowdsource some of the best ways to do this. And I'm going to have a couple of different prompts, and we're going to use a waterfall chat, which in and of itself is an active learning technique, where people are going to write an answer to a question that I ask in the chat, but you're not going to hit enter until I tell you, and then it all comes in at once. So the first thing is I want everyone to come up with their favorite general, easy to use, easy to implement, no prep needed active learning technique that you can pull out of your back pocket in any class that you teach. You know, type it in the chat. I'll give you a couple seconds, and don't hit enter till I tell you go. All right, hit enter. All right. So right away, we see kind of when I say active learning, the first technique that many people think of is the think, pair, share. This technique is so widely used. My kids have been doing this in elementary school since first grade with their teachers. They knew what think, pair, shares were. They came home. Like it's a big thing. I think think, pair, shares are excellent. And for those of you who don't know what these are, just to make sure that we know, so when you ask your students to kind of think about something, think about an answer to a question, a resolution to a crisis or something like that, then they get together with a partner, they kind of talk through their various responses to whatever that prompt was, and then they're given an opportunity to share out to the classroom. There's lots of variations of this. A variation is think, pair, square, share, which is you have people think individually, then they pair up, then the pairs pair up, and then they share out. And there's lots of ways that you can do this. And by the way, I once had a colleague said they really wish they could do think, pair, square, share in their class, but their class was not divisible by 4. There's nothing magical about 4, right? So it's just you have smaller groups, then slightly larger groups, then the whole group. So any of the techniques that we talk about, you don't have to do exactly as they're kind of described or how someone else did them. You can adapt them to your own surroundings. But think, pair, share is a big one. I love this one. I do think, however, and I've made this mistake myself, sometimes when we use think, pair, share, we forget the think part. We forget to give our students the opportunity to think as individuals. We sometimes pair them too quickly, and then you have 2 people who don't know the answer rather than 2 people who do have an answer that they discuss. So if you're going to use this, I highly recommend you allow for thinking before pairing and sharing. We have questions and answers coming up. We have either ors. Either ors are fun, right? I've had people even call these the would you rather, you know, to kind of make them a little bit more fun. Posing non-evaluative questions, speed dating style conversations. Melissa, would you be comfortable kind of providing a little bit more of an explanation of that one?
Sure. Sorry, I was eating some lunch.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No worries. So speed dating is when you can arrange the chairs however you want, but 2 rows can work, or an inner circle and an outer circle. And basically every student is paired up with another student. And then if it's in circles, like the outside one rotates. If it's in lines, you can have the whole thing kind of just do clockwise or counterclockwise. And you have to remind students which way clockwise is. But you basically give them a question or a prompt and they talk with the partner that they have, and then they rotate. You can continue with the same question or you can give them a different question. Each time that you rotate, you can do any length amount of time. If you have an odd number of students, then you just have one group that's designated as a group of 3. And you can either say you're going to talk with the same partner once in a while, or you just have one of those rotate 2 spots instead of 1 spot so that they're not always in that group of 3. So that's the only kind of snag, is if you have an odd number, but a group of 3 tends to work just fine. Does that explain what the speed dating is clearly enough?
I think it does. And I like that structural element of the inner circle and the outer circle. I think that was the piece I was having a hard time wrapping my head around, but that makes absolute sense. Thank you. Beth talks about think, pair, share, as well as turn and talk, which are very similar kinds of strategies. Clarissa says, asking students to think about a hypothetical situation that's contrary to what you're learning or what they would expect, and says uses this when they don't want to talk. So having something in your back pocket to help students talk when they don't want to is amazing. Clarissa, would you give us an example of when you've used that?
Oh gosh, I'm trying to think of an example. Because usually what happens with a hypothetical example, if it's something contrary, no one thinks they know the answer and they're more willing to talk than like if I give a more obvious question, they're like, "Ooh, I'm not sure what the answer is. I don't want to look stupid." Gosh, I'm trying to think of when I've used this last, because usually my students will talk now because we do the think, pair, share for everything. So that usually helps them. I'm trying to think what I'm learning this week. Oh, I know. Here's a really good example. So we did an activity where they really were not engaged in the activity. Like they were pooping out on the activity. I'm like, "You're not even doing the activity, you guys. Let's talk about it." And then I was like, "For those of you who liked it, why did you like it?" And everyone's like, "Oh, I don't want to talk about it." So I'm like, "Okay, for those of you who really hated this activity, why did you super hate this activity? And you literally just sat out and didn't even want to do it." And then they just started talking. And I was like, "Well, what if other students came in and didn't want to do the activity? How would you teach the concept we're going to learn today if we didn't do the activity?" And it actually ended up in a discussion over 3 days of class where we talked about tolerance for ambiguity. But we keep talking about it now because I keep going back to that situation, saying you were supposed to do this thing and you did this thing. And now we're going to talk about how contrary you were that day constantly in class because it says something about us as a group.
So I love the activity, but I also love that you explored why they were pooping out on the activity as you described. That was kind of neat. And then gave them the opportunity to come up with something better. And I think sometimes students will recognize the value when they can't think of an alternative. So that's excellent. I love that. We get some more love for the think, pair, share. We get using the whiteboard and asking what they like about the topic we want to discuss in the class. I think it's a great primer for getting students to kind of think about what it is that they like. And it also helps us kind of cater some of our conversation toward what they like. Andy talked about top 10, top 5, top 3. I love these. I use these all the time. For instance, when I teach this in my Etsy class, we might have top 5 active learning strategies, and then actually always have them winnow it down to their favorite one to kind of have an evaluative element there too. But I love top 5s, top 10s, top 3s. Pair and square rhyme, which is why I use that. Very nice, Beth. Write, pair, share. So this is a little bit more of a formalized of that thinking. So it's not enough that you trust them to think, they actually articulate it onto paper. I think this makes it a little safer, especially if a student is a little bit more on the quiet side or the introverted side. Because in my experience, if you put people in small groups, the extroverts are going to do a lot of the talking. If everyone has written something down, it might actually remind people, wait, I've got something I want to say. And if you structure it to allow each of them to share their ideas before you come to some kind of group evaluation, I think it's a great way to do that. So
Can I add to that a little, Don, too? So it works really well as a free write where you just give them time in class, but you can also have them do this with assignments that they've prepared outside of class. I do think it's important to tell students ahead of time that they're going to be sharing their work when they turn it in, because they might just assume that you, or if you have graders, are looking at it. But I tell my students in my CAT community, we're going to share bits and pieces of this. And I also like to give them options. Sometimes I'll tell them in advance, you're going to share the entire thing. So know that when you write this and you've got 3 things to choose from, or I will tell them you're going to share, but what you share from that writing assignment is up to you. So they might write a couple of pages, but they only share a couple ideas.
Nice.
And I would just add that I think a lot of active learning activities and techniques tend to favor extroverted learners, or just tend to lean that way. And so I think as instructors, we have to be intentional about framing the activities in a way that introverted learners don't feel like they're at a disadvantage.
I think that is an absolutely amazing point to make. And we can do this with how we structure it and how we have the expectations, the products we're going to do. So it's not just the loudest voice doing it. For those of you who've kind of heard me talk about group projects before, which we'll talk about kind of higher intensity, higher effort active learning a little bit. I didn't like group projects because I didn't trust other people to do as well as I might. So it's one of those kind of things where I would actually take on all the work myself because I didn't want other people to do it for me. I didn't trust that we would get the grade I wanted. If I wasn't the person running the show. Andy, I see your hand up.
That it just reminded me of one other thing that I do in my classes when I have them work in groups to kind of support the introvert extrovert dynamic, is that a lot of times when I'm having them work in groups of 3 or 4, I'll have them self-assign roles. So I'll tell them like one person needs to be facilitator, one person needs to be the scribe, or the person who takes notes about what they're doing or what they're working on. One person is going to be the spokesperson who's going to then report back to the rest of the group. You can come up with different roles depending on what the activity is and what needs to get accomplished, but having some that are better for the students that kind of want to take it in and write or be less out there, and then have the role for the students who want to be a little bit more outgoing and engaging, and then always having a facilitator to make sure that everyone is contributing. And if you see one person who's talking a lot, that would tend to be me, then that facilitator can say, great, we've heard from Andy, like now let's hear, we haven't heard from Ashley yet, so now Ashley can give her opinion or things like that.
Very nice. Melissa mentions anything that makes them move, especially if your classroom allows for that. Some of my classes kind of don't, really big lecture spaces, but if you can get your students to move, and that's something your students, can do in reasonable ways, it's absolutely something to consider. Beth, you have stand up, hand up, pair up. Could you describe that a little bit more? I think I'm getting that by context clues, but could you let us know what that is?
Yeah, so this is just when she mentioned anything that makes them move, this made me think of that, because when I can tell that they just need to get up and move, I have them do this. So they stand up, they put their hand up, and they walk around the room until I tell them to pair up. I usually will say pair up, or I've done a musical kind of pairing version of this where the music plays and when it stops, you pair up. So you walk around the room, and the goal is to find somebody that you're not sitting with, that you don't, you haven't actively engaged with yet. And the hand up, then they give each other a high five, and that's their pair. And then they share. And so we do whatever the activity is, the prompt is then for that sharing. So, and then I've also had them do the square even after that, like now find another pair and square up and share. But the stand up, hand up, pair up is just a way to get them up and moving, especially in some of those long class sessions.
If you want to take that even further, an activity we used to do on the outdoor challenge course with groups is called the high five mingle or high five handshake. And you end up with like 5 or 6 different partnerships if your class is large enough. So you start with the high five mingle, and they talk about something. We usually did on the challenge course, we do like, what's your favorite food? What's your favorite vacation spot? Things like that. But they do a high five partnership first, and then they mingle and they choose somebody they haven't been a partner with, and that's their low five partner. And then their Top Gun partner and their fist bump partner. You can make up whatever kind of handshakes you want, but the goal is to end up with 5 or 6 different partnerships, and they have to remember who their partner was for each handshake. And so you can tell them to keep track of those partnerships throughout the semester. And whenever you need them to pair up with somebody, you just call one out. Hey, find your fist bump partner and talk to them about this. Find your high five partner and talk to them about this. And so you can, if you do it early in the semester and make sure that they remember or write down who their partner was for each handshake, then you've got a way to automatically pair people up spontaneously whenever you want them to get together with somebody.
What is Top Gun?
I was going to say, is that they got to say, I feel the need for speed before they high five?
Top Gun is when they're kind of passing each other and they do the high five and then the low five from behind.
Gotcha.
Yeah, they need to put the quote in. Without the quote, it's just not legit though. That is really cool. I love the creativity there. That is awesome. Melissa points out, and this is something that might be kind of surprising, that students might actually want to get called on to share. They might actually want to be given that opportunity and maybe feel, that if they're raising their hand, that might be a little bit intrusive or a little bit too forward. And then giving them the opportunity to pass, which I think is cool. So as long as that's something that we're willing to do. So if you're going to say, all right, Brandon, I want you to share this, and Brandon says pass, and we're not like, well, Brandon, are you sure? Like, as long as we're willing to actually let Brandon pass, I think that is a great thing to do. I've found that when I have my students pass in stuff, I'll often kind of peek at the names and things like that. And then I might say, hey, Brandon, do you have any ideas on this? Knowing that Brandon has a wonderful idea. And I found some good luck with that, because then the student is sharing something that they kind of realize I might think is good. They're getting some initial validation, and then they're able to share out to the class. But I love that Andy lets fate kind of make the call by kind of having names on note cards. My Latin teacher in college had that, and my name came up way more than chance would allow. So I don't know that he was actually reading the names on those note cards. So if you do it by fate, really let fate decide.
I mean, sometimes I do call on people specifically. I lie, but at least it gives the illusion that it's not me calling on them specifically.
So Andy has also very coolly dropped a resource into the chat with lots of different active learning techniques that I have just downloaded, and I have not had time to go through all of them, but I think that is amazing. Thank you for sharing that, Andy. I'm going to move us to our next question. Our next question is, these are the easy ones, right? These are the ones you have in your back pocket as part of your arsenal. Like Carissa said, students pooping out, we'll pull this out and we'll get everybody back engaged. What is your favorite that's going to take some time, maybe some structure, maybe it's part of a big assessment, but what's your kind of go-to big active learning technique? I'll give you a couple minutes to kind of think about it, and then we'll write it into the chat. Give everyone about 10 more seconds, then we'll hit enter. All right, hit enter. All right, so I knew when I was hitting enter, so I always get to press enter first. So the one I had kind of put on there was my Design a Society top 10. I love this. This is actually something that students will tell me like years after they did it in my class, they really enjoyed it. What I have my students do, and I actually give a very small amount of extra credit for the winners of this. It's actually a competitive game. They have to come up with top 10 ways to design a society, and then I'll give them the kind of society I want them to decide. Sometimes it's the most hierarchical and prejudice oppressive society they can. Other times it's the most egalitarian, equitable society that they can. And what they'll do is they'll sit together and they'll come up with these top 10. And then I have a panel of social psych grad students who I consider content matter experts actually rate which ones are the best. And then the winners get some extra credit points that go along with it. And what happens is after they do it, we break it down for all the things we know about prejudice and group conflict and empathy and conflict resolution, and kind of seeing how those come from, and then where they see examples in the world, either currently or historically. So it's something that students have said is a really kind of powerful thing for them to kind of think about how a system creates the treatment of individuals. So it's one that I've been using for a long time. I really like, and I hit enter first. So there we go. Andy, would you like to describe Jigsaw?
Yeah, Jigsaw is one of my favorites. So the idea is that you put students in groups, and each group has a different topic, a different thing. Sometimes I'll have images that each group has, or a different text that each group has that they have to explore, prepare, like engage with in some way. And then after they've had sufficient time to engage, discuss, analyze, evaluate, whatever the thing is they're doing in those groups, then you switch the groups up, and so that each new group has at least one member from the previous groups. And then each person is a representative from their original group, and they explain to the rest, they have to teach what they discussed in the rest of in their original group to the rest of their new group. And then usually at the end of that activity, I have some kind of analysis, synthesis activity that the new group does, bringing all that information together, asking them a few questions to think about, okay, what does this tell us about whatever the topic is? But that one's always a really fun one, and it's great to get students to teach each other what they discussed. I think that one's fun.
I think Jigsaw is a super amazing educational technique. It's also something that Elliot Aronson, who's considered one of the kind of founders of social psychology, used to actually break down intergroup conflict. So he actually was able to get school systems in Texas back in the 40s and 50s to use Jigsaw to integrate white and Black students, and found that white, Black students, Latinx students were able to have better attitudes, not only about each other, but about learning when they worked in Jigsaw groups. So kind of historically, I love this technique, not only for its power to teach, but for power to get us closer together and create community. So that is awesome. I love that, Andy. Beth, what is this Twitter chat simulation?
Well, I don't know if I can call it Twitter anymore, but I still call it Twitter in my class because I don't like this whole X thing. But I basically use Padlet, which is another software that can be used that can students can create posts on, and I set up the background to make it look like Twitter. And basically I post a question that I want them to respond to, and we handle it like a Twitter chat. So if you've ever done a Twitter chat, like on Twitter, you know, like the moderator posts questions and then everybody responds. And so you see them go all throughout like the whole Twitter, you know, universe. It's not like a response on the moderator's post itself, right? So everybody has their own posts to the question. And then they go back through and they read and respond to their classmates posts and answers in that time frame. And then I usually have 3 to 4 questions in a Twitter chat. It takes about 30 minutes. But what it is it's a much more informal discussion type board, but very interactive. My students love them. They appreciate them. You know, on Twitter, you can't use more than so many characters, so you have to be concise. So they, you know, they're not expected to present these massive, you know, discussion posts. So it just kind of, and it brings it into kind of the social media realm. I use the structure and function of social media, which many of them use a lot, maybe not Twitter, but other social media outlets. And so it makes it a little bit more of a relevant experience to them too.
I love that. That is fantastic. Clarissa talks about having big puzzles kind of solved together, discussing in-class strategies, sort of similar to Jigsaw in some ways there. Melissa and some others talk about student presentations and co-teaching, and giving students actually the opportunity to think about, how do I communicate my knowledge to other people, which is definitely going to deepen the learning. As Cheryl says, teaching is the highest form of learning. I agree. Other people like student-led teaching. Let's see. Top 10s for organizational behavior class, worst workplace possible, best workplace possible, worst classroom possible. That one would make me feel a little vulnerable if I was asking my students to do that. I'd be a little bit nervous. Best classroom possible, classroom and workplace comparisons to tie concepts to what they always know. I love that establishment of personal relevance. Ted, making the instructor dance with either positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. I don't know that I'm busting that one out, Ted. How does that go for you? You're muted, Ted. I think Ted is typing. He said every time he's done it, the students have loved it. Got to be willing to be a little goofy for your students sometimes. I think as long as we do that without sacrificing our legitimacy, I think that's amazing. So very, very nice there. I love the authenticity, and anyone who has met Ted, I'm not surprised Ted wrote that in the chat, right? It's that would fit Ted's personality. That would be something he is comfortable doing. And I haven't said it today, but it's something I say often. Anytime you hear a recommendation, an idea from a colleague, decide whether or not it's going to work for you, right? Just because something works for a colleague doesn't mean it's going to work for you, doesn't mean you don't need to adjust it or even just discard it. So, always give yourself that kind of opportunity. Melissa actually raises a really good point. I wanted to take a second to read it before I commented on it. And talking about the introvert extrovert thing is not necessarily just how shy they are. My understanding, the way that I was taught as a psychologist, is introvert extrovert is where energy goes. And that as an extrovert, we gain energy from other people. As an introvert, we give energy to other people. So I'm actually a very introverted person who appears very extroverted in terms of my behaviors. But then after I teach, I go to my office and collapse. That's kind of how that works. I've given you everything, and now I need to go and recover. Where an extrovert, they're excited, they're energized, when they get done teaching and those kind of things. So yes, we do use those terms a little bit in a lazy way. I know I'm definitely guilty of myself, and that's a wonderful point to make, Melissa. So we're getting close to being done. Is there anything else? Anything you've been kind of hiding? Anything you've been kind of saying, you know what, this is my best one, but I'm afraid to share. And now you're saying, well, I only got a little bit of time left. Now's my time. Does anyone have something they want to put out there as their best active learning technique that they haven't heard talked about already?
This isn't a technique, and I can't remember who said it in the chat earlier, but and with the introvert thing or the shyness thing, just remembering that active learning doesn't always look super active. Like the activity might be going on in the student's brain and we don't always see it. And so just remembering that, especially if you have a whole class full that the activity is in their brain, sometimes doing and I know you do this, Dawn, you do a quick checkout at the end of class, maybe even the 6-word thing. What did you get out of class today? You can build it into your class or just have them grab a piece of paper or something. And sometimes they're a lot more actively involved than it appears. So I think just important to remember that too, whether it's the whole class or certain students.
And that sets up our last thing really, really nicely, Melissa. One of my favorite active learning techniques is the exit ticket. And the exit ticket is something you have your students do right at the end of class. It's kind of I like to do it as a reflection. So one of the things that I want to have you do is before you leave today, and I'll do my announcements real quick before the exit ticket, we're going to have a post-event survey. You can get a professional development certificate. Our videos are archived. Next week, we got Camilla Roberts talking about academic integrity, all kind of cool things. But your exit ticket today in the chat before you go, I want you to put in here something cool that you're going to try based on our conversation. And Beth said she calls her exit tickets LOL's line of learnings. Okay, I get you. And you can just put these in as they go. We won't have to waterfall chat it. So just as you put something you're going to try. So Ted's going to infuse empathy in course design. Clarissa's doing some top 10s. Deborah's doing some right pair shares. I definitely like that adaptation of the think pair shares. And here's that awkward silence. We're waiting for more stuff to come into the chat. So we got some other top 10s. We got checking in with students and sharing mental health resources in advance of midterms. That's kind of the drop the mic one, I think, for kind of our conversation today, is kind of letting our students know that they matter and they care and we're here for them. And if they don't learn, that's something we got to help them with. I think kind of putting our students to blame for their own experience is something hopefully we've grown past, and hopefully we can be more empathetic and let people know that they don't have to suffer in silence. As always, I love this space that we have all together. Thank you so much for being here. Next week, we got a wonderful thing coming up too. If anyone needs to stay and chat for a little bit more, I'll be here for another minute or two. But otherwise, thank you so much for being here and have a great rest of your afternoon.